Yeah, just let me know when we're live.
I mean, technically we're live right now, but I'm still getting the links and everything. I need to get the embed link.
Live.
Embed, show more. Copy that. Let's throw it in here. That should be correct. If you head over to the rotoviz.com/live page, tell me if you see us live. Yep.
We're live here.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay.
And the page is updated. So I'm going to tweet this out that we are live and we can get going in just a minute.
All right. Yeah, I see us there. We're looking good. All right.
All right, go for it.
Go for it. All right. Hello, everybody. We are live. I'm Matt Friedman, Matt at the Oracle of Fantasy Labs and RotoViz. Welcome to the May 7th, 2017 NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Giffen. You can follow him on Twitter at RotoDoc. He's an editor at RotoViz, a PhD in mathematics, a two-time qualifier for the DraftKings NASCAR main event, and one of the best NASCAR DFS players in the world. He is the reason that we are here. Nick, how's it going?
I'm doing wonderful. Got Talladega is an exciting race. It's probably going to be a little bit wild. It's a beautiful day there in Alabama. It's sunny, 75 for the high, so perfect racing conditions. And right now, there's a little bit of overlay in the $27 buy-in 80K Victory Lane GPP. It's only about 2/3 full, so I foresee maybe a bit of overlay in that one if you're looking for some free money. Not exactly free money, but we'll make it free money with this show here.
Yeah, if you're looking for some plus EV exposure, that'd be a good thing. Okay, so Nick, we had the Talladega podcast on Friday night. We talked about strategy for the race. It's one of the two that track is one of the two restrictor plate tracks on the NASCAR circuit, and there are two races there per year. Talk to us about Talladega and what we should expect there.
Yeah, so, I mean, as we've talked about, Talladega, restrictor plate track, so all the cars are going to be limited on their speed. That means they run in a big pack in the draft, and they all run really close together, so it's very easy to pass, very easy to go from the front to the back, harder to come from the back to the front, but still very doable within a handful of laps. So Talladega is just a wild race, but if somebody in the middle or the front part of that pack gets all out of line and squirrely and loses it, then all of a sudden we can get what's called the big one, where we get 5, 10, 15, or even 20 cars involved in a wreck. So that means place differential ends up being pretty important. We're definitely going to stress place differential. There will be some differences from Daytona. With Daytona, especially with the 500, because of the way the qualifying system works there with the duels and everything like that, we get some big names that qualify in the back. We didn't really get that this time. We got Jimmy Johnson in 30th. If you want to call Chris Buescher and Danica Patrick bigger names, they're in 35th and 31st qualifying position. But we really got mostly the back markers qualifying in the back, the mid markers qualifying in the middle, and the front guys qualifying up front. So it means, while place differential is still important, I think more so than Daytona, we can take a couple shots on guys starting a little bit further forward.
Mm-hmm. And the biggest name of them all, Ricky Stenhouse Jr., starting on the pole. Okay, so Nick, in the podcast on Friday night, I asked you if you had done any research on starting position and DNF rate and kind of like the likelihood of getting in the big one, and you said that you would do some research on that. Have you actually done any research on that?
I actually have. So let's see. I took the average, sorry, thinking about it, and I took the average of all the guys who finished at Talladega and all the guys who didn't finish, and the average, so just doing like a t-test, was 21.2 for the average starting position of the guys that finished, and 23.0 for the average starting position of the guys that didn't finish. So, technically statistically significant, but is it practically significant? That 1.5 places, not so sure. So when I actually threw it in a model, when I did kind of a logistic regression on it, it was barely mildly statistically significant. It didn't really help any much with predicting on out of sample data. So by and large, pretty random. Maybe just a tiny bit of influence on starting position. I do think though, because we've got all these back markers qualifying in the back, there's a chance that some of them just hang out in the back all race and avoid some of these big ones. So I still think it's possible we can do a lineup where we get 3 or 4 of these guys starting in the 30s, especially some of the the crappier names, air quote crappier names like Reed Sorensen or Joey Gase or Cole Witt, for example. Those are definitely viable plays this week.
Yeah, I mean, they're crappier, but they're still viable. Okay, so we didn't talk about any picks on Friday because qualifying hadn't happened yet. Talk to us about qualifying. Was there anything notable or just sort of like, normal stuff as we normally haven't seen this season, but was it just sort of like your normal bland typical qualifying?
It actually was for once. Everybody made it through tech inspection. No people being sent to the back for punctures of tires or anything like that. No penalties like we had last week with Austin Dillon.
No illegal suspension systems that we know of yet.
Yeah, exactly. So we're in good shape here. And even if anybody did get sent to the back, I don't care for Talladega. You can get to the front in 3 laps if you got a good car.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about some picks here, and then we'll get to some of the Twitter questions. But in terms of, dominators don't matter so much at Talladega, but do you have any dominator picks, that you have?
Yeah, so you're right. Dominator points don't matter as much here. They might matter a little more maybe than the Daytona 500 specifically, just because we have some of those big names who tend to qualify in the back at the Daytona 500 because of the duels where people wreck in the duels and then end up in the back for the start of the race. But they might matter just a tiny bit more, but they really don't matter. If we do get a guy that's going to dominate the race, my guess is it'll come from one of these 3 or 4 drivers. It'll probably be either Brad Keselowski. He's been really good at getting out front and right in that pocket of air with the other cars kind of behind him and just switching lanes to stay in front of the faster moving lane. Could be Dale Jr. He's also, of course, a restrictor plate guru, had a very fast car in qualifying. And I think there's a little extra motivation to win at Talladega in his final year now. I certainly buy into that narrative a little bit, I think, especially at the restrictor plate tracks for Dale Jr. Kind of like we bought into that for Tony Stewart at the road course or Jeff Gordon at Martinsville when they won in their final years. I think certainly Dale Jr. at Talladega, at Daytona, there's maybe a little extra oomph there. Also, possibly Joey Logano. Penske's won, other than the Daytona 500, they won the prior 4 restrictor plate races. Logano won 3, Keselowski won 1. So certainly Logano can get out front. He also qualified, I think it was 12th. It's either 11th or 12th. I need to pull up my numbers here. But either way, that means there's some place differential potential as well. It is 12th. And then Danny Hamlin, who also qualified in 11th. We know how great he is at the restrictor plate tracks. And he's been kind of under the radar this week relative to Logano, Keselowski, maybe Jr., some of the Harvick, some of the names who could be potential dominators. So I like getting a little bit under the radar Denny Hamlin at a restrictor plate track.
Sure, and we definitely don't want to forget about Trevor Bayne starting 5th.
That's right. There's that guy that we are fading this week.
All right. For cash games, you had mentioned sort of strategically that it's basically place differential. That's where you're looking. So obviously you want to start in the back half and probably more like 30 to 40 range for those drivers. But any thoughts on who you're looking at there?
In the 30 to 40 range?
Yeah, I guess just for place differentials in general.
Mm-hmm. So I think some of the more obvious names are Chris Buescher, who qualified in 34th. Elliott Sadler qualified in 35th. With Buescher, it's just equipment. He's in that JTG Doherty equipment. We know that he's in probably the best equipment if anybody's starting 32nd or worse. Elliott Sadler's a great restrictor plate racer. He's won multiple times at Talladega in the Xfinity Series. He's a long-time NASCAR veteran. Also has been in contention for wins in the Cup Series. I think he may have even won one at either Talladega or Daytona. I don't have that stat in front of me, but definitely has been in contention for wins, finished second multiple times, finished second in the Daytona 500 before. So those are the obvious names starting in the 30s. Danica Patrick qualified 31st. She's certainly an obvious name. But then I think some of the names that are probably a little underrated would be Cole Witt. I don't know if Cole Witt's going to be underrated. I think people know his restrictor plate racing prowess. He did very well at the Daytona 500. He's done very well at restrictor plate races in the past, has been multiple times in the winning lineup. But then Joey Gase in 39th starting position is a guy I think will be under the radar this week. Joey Gase has had 2 top 7 finishes in the Xfinity Series at plate tracks, one at Talladega, one at Daytona. Certainly, it's not the Xfinity Series, but certainly he could hang around the back of the pack, avoid some of the wrecks, and then place there in 18th, 16th position, maybe even try to push into the top 12 by the end of the race. Not out of the realm of possibility. 39th starting position, there's only he basically can only go up. Unless he's the first guy to go out, So Joey Gase, I think, will be an under-the-radar name. And then I'm probably avoiding Greg Galding in that 30 to 40 starting position. He's never, ever, ever started a race on a restrictor plate track at any level of NASCAR, and that's because he wasn't old enough to. There's a rule in NASCAR where you can't race on tracks more than, I think it's a mile long, until you turn 18 years old. So when he was racing in the trucks in the Xfinity Series, he was racing on only 1 mile or smaller tracks. And that's why he wasn't allowed. Well, he technically didn't have the experience to start the Daytona 500, so he didn't attempt to race the Daytona 500. This is his first restrictor plate experience ever. I like to use veterans more at restrictor plate tracks than I like to use rookies. I can certainly see maybe some rookie mistakes or just having some troubles with the draft. So Greg Galding is a name I want to avoid. And I think that's pretty much where we stand on the 30s to 40s. Obviously, Jimmy Johnson qualified 30th. We're using him all day.
Okay, so quick question. This is a little aside here. How old is Greg Galding?
I think he's 18 and a bit, right?
Is that pretty uncommon for NASCAR drivers to start out that young?
He's actually 19 now. He turned 19 right before the Daytona 500. But it's not that uncommon these days. It probably was more uncommon back in the day. But Kyle Larson, Joey Logano, these are some of the names that got their start at 18 years old in NASCAR's National Series. There's been a few other names as well, but those are 2 of the guys that have certainly made the leap up to the next level. Joey Logano was in the Cup Series, I believe, at age 19 as well. So not as unusual these days as it was maybe 10, 15 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm. If I were John Moore, I'd be talking about this guy's Phenom Index score and everything like that. But just kind of curious about that.
So I actually have age as a variable in my NASCAR data, and it does show up very, very slightly at restrictor plate tracks. It doesn't really show up at most other tracks, but at restrictor plate tracks, it does show up as a little bit of added extra predictability, like 1% added out of sample prediction power.
And this is curious to go further down the rabbit hole. Do you think that's because restrictor plate races perhaps require a little more skill? Like they're a little less equipment dependent because everyone's going the same speed, so skill matters more.
Yeah, definitely. There's drivers that are, and if you're not a good restrictor plate racer, let's put it this way: it doesn't mean you're not skilled. It just means you're not skilled at that form of racing, and that's certainly something that you can develop. But I agree with you. If you're skilled at restrictor plate racing, that's a huge advantage because all the cars are equal for the most part. Not completely equal, but that's why guys like David Reagan can pull off wins in these crappier cars. Had multiple restrictor plate wins. One time when he was with Roush Fenway, he won at Daytona. Another time, of course, at Front Row Motorsports, he won at Talladega. So you get these guys that are just good at at restrictor plate racing. Eric Almirola, for example. So it's definitely an equalizer in terms of equipment, and that's where restrictor plate talent comes in, and that is often developed over time. Usually, you don't see a rookie go on and do crazy things at restrictor plate tracks. It's happened before. I mean, Trevor Bayne won the Daytona 500 in his first restrictor plate race ever, but our boy Trevor Bayne, right? But it's pretty rare. It's not that common that a rookie will end up in the winning lineup.
All right. Give me a couple GPP guys you're having your eye on right now, and then we're going to get to some Twitter stuff.
Sure. So I talked about Joey Gase. I think I really like him as a GPP play. Brendan Gaughan qualified 32nd. Certainly a veteran who's got some very good restrictor plate racing experience and was in the winning lineup at the Daytona 500 slate. Another GPP play that I think a lot of people are on is Ty Dillon. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get some exposure to Ty Dillon, but pivot off of him with the two drivers around him, AJ Allmendinger and David Reagan, because I think Ty Dillon will be the most popular of the three in that starting range, and we really want to leverage ownership percentages here. So I'm actually, while I like Ty Dillon, definitely like him, I think he's probably the best in that range and has the highest overall projection. I would think it doesn't say by my model, but I think just subjectively, I think Ty Dillon's probably the best play of those three from a average perspective. I like the theory side of using Allmendinger and David Reagan. If we want to go a little bit further forward, I haven't heard too much buzz around Jamie McMurray this week, 23rd. 2 wins in his career at Talladega, plus a Daytona 500 win, plus a Coke 400 or Pepsi 400, whatever. It's switched between Coke and Pepsi, which is the July Daytona race. So he's got 4 restrictor plate wins in his career, and he's starting 23rd. If this guy pushes into the top 3, he'll be in the winning lineup for sure. So I like Jamie McMurray. I think people are more on Larson than McMurray. Give me McMurray 2 spots further back and the better restrictor plate racing resume, and even more of a veteran than Larson.
All right, so we're going to get to the Twitter questions. First, I want to remind you that you can get a 30% discount to a special NASCAR pass through the NASCAR podcast homepage, rotoviz.com/NASCAR podcast. I don't know why I'm mentioning that right now, because I just realized that if you are watching this right now, you have the NASCAR pass. So thank you for subscribing us.
Well, if you only have the weekly subscription, bump up to the year-long subscription, because that's a 30% discount, and you get it for the rest of the year. It comes out to a much cheaper rate than if you're buying it every week or every month.
Yeah, that's true. It's definitely the way to go. And then, of course, if you want more NASCAR insight from RotoDoc, Nick has courses at Roto Academy. One of those is a video course with JM to Win of Roto Grinders. You can check those out at rotogrinders.com/Roto Academy. Okay, Nick, let's talk about Talladega Superspeedway. Let's see. The first question here, Larson made no practice laps. Thoughts?
Not concerned about it. He knows how to race restrictor plate, tracks, and maybe his car won't be handling 100% perfectly at the beginning, but I'm sure they're going to get it worked on. And in the draft, it doesn't matter as much anyway, especially at Talladega relative to Daytona, where handling matters more at Daytona than it does at Talladega. Not that it doesn't matter at all at Talladega, but certainly it matters more at Daytona, relatively speaking. Not worried at all.
Mm-hmm. All right. Someone's asking, and obviously the answer to this is yes. So I'm going to amend their question. But are there any drivers? Oh, sorry. I'm reading this incorrectly. So I'm just going to ask their question the way they asked it. Are there any drivers over 9,000 not named Larson or Jimmy you would play?
Over 9,000 not named Larson or Jimmy that I would play? Yeah, definitely. There's plenty of drivers over 9,000 that I'd play. Like I said, we don't have to just play guys from the back here relative to what we would kind of do at Daytona, where Truex was in the back, Blaney was in the back, Eric Jones, all those big names are in the back. We really only have Jimmy Johnson. So I think Joey Logano's a fine play there in 12th. If he gets out front, leads a handful of laps, and wins the race, he'll probably be in the winning lineup. I think Truex in 13th is playable. I wouldn't go crazy on him, obviously. I do think both Keselowski and Dale Jr. are playable. I wouldn't go crazy on them. 5-10% exposure tops. Keselowski, I might even go more than 10%. I think he's the guy that can get out front and ride that pocket of air and lead 70, 80 laps. And if he wins the race, then he'll probably be in the winning lineup. Like I said, at Talladega, there have been about 4 or 5 drivers over the last 24 races that have ended up in the winning lineup. And if anybody's going to do it, starting in the top 3. And if anybody's going to do it, I think it's going to be Brad Keselowski. So I don't think, like I said, don't have too much exposure to him. Little over 10% probably tops, but I think that's not a bad thing to do. And then finally, I don't mind a tiny bit of Kevin Harvick. Not a lot, a tiny bit. I like stacking Kevin Harvick with Clint Bowyer. Their teammates, Bowyer and Harvick, have very fast cars. The Fords have been super fast in the draft, working very well together. They were fastest in the one and only practice we had in the draft together. So I don't mind stacking Harvick with Boyer. That's a play where you're hoping, they kind of finish 1-2. It's not a high percentage play, but I think it's a GPP play that you can have a little bit of exposure to.
Yeah, and so you have Harvick starting 6th and Boyer starting 17th. That's interesting there.
Yeah, and then if I did that, obviously everybody else I'd have probably starting 23rd or worse, with McMurray being the highest there of the rest of them.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I asked you this on Friday, but it was kind of premature. But now you probably have a little bit of insight, although it's still very random. Who is your pick to win today?
Gosh, that's a tough one. For me, it's going to be between Brad Keselowski, Dale Jr., and Joey Logano. If I really had to make a choice, I think I'm going to go with Keselowski.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the guys you would pick to dominate are the likeliest to win.
Yeah, and my dark horse to win is Clint Boyer.
All right. Moving on. Which drivers starting in the top 15 do you think have a chance? Well, we already answered that. Have a chance of dominating. In 3 entry max, how many teams do you put Johnson in? That's interesting.
I like that question. I probably put him in 1. I think he's going to go between. So my model has him projected at about 60% ownership, which I think makes sense given he's starting 30th. And the highest we saw Truex, for example, in the Daytona 500 was about 50%. We don't have as many big names starting that far back like we had in the Daytona 500. So I think we could see, especially in the higher stakes GPPs, the 27 and up, Johnson closer to 60%. I like being underweight on him if he's going to be even 45% owned. I don't want more than 45% exposure to any guy, so I would do 1 of 3.
Mm-hmm. Okay, kind of big picture question here. So let's say you could put a single bullet in a GPP, or you're maybe max entering where it's only like 3 that you can put in, or it's larger field where you can put in many more. In terms of like strategy, what is your strategy for those 3 different scenarios? 1 bullet, 3 max, and then kind of mini max.
So
entry.
for the mass multi-entry, I'm just leveraging ownership percentages. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm doing. It's purely a game theory type race. Projections don't matter at Talladega. If you're using my projections, that's fine. That's great. But I'm totally just leveraging ownership percentages. I'm trying to go overweight on drivers I think will be under-owned, and a little underweight on drivers I think will be over-owned. That's purely what I'm doing in mass multi-entry. In 3 max, what I'm probably doing is I'm probably going high leverage, even higher leverage. I think there's no reason to kind of just play it game theory optimal, in my opinion. I think you either want to, like I said, do Johnson in 1 of 3 or even 0 of 3, or do him in all 3. I think you really want to go with leverage in the 3 max, because there's no point in just kind of being around. Obviously with 3 entries, you can only have 0, 33, 67, or 100% exposure, but there's no point in being close to the percentages that everybody else will be on drivers. You want to leverage one way or the other. For single entry, just make your best GPP lineup. That's all I really can say about that. Whatever you feel is the best GPP lineup, definitely get a guy who's going to have low ownership percentage in that one lineup.
Mm-hmm. So in the 3 max versus mass entry, you think that the field as a whole will probably tend to be chalkier, and then that's why it would be worth going even further contrarian?
No, I don't think the field will necessarily be. I mean, it'll probably be a little chalkier. I definitely would think so. But my point is, whether the level of chalk increases or decreases, I don't want to be close to what the field is.
Right.
Because you're not getting any. You only have 3 entries. Like if you're mass multi-entering, I actually don't mind being a little close to the field, because it's kind of game theory optimal. I wouldn't say close to the field, but I would say do like a GTO strategy possibly is fine, because if you say a guy's 35% to be in the winning lineup, play him 35%. So if he's 50% owned, you're going to be to the good, and if he's 15% owned, you're going to be to the good. But in a 3 max, there's no point in being close to at least to the field. So you just want to leverage one way or the other. Go heavier on certain drivers and lighter on certain drivers relative to the field, because if you're equal weight to the field, you only have 3 entries, you're almost surely not going to win.
All right, what are the pros and cons of fading Austin Dillon today, and then who is a good pivot in GPPs? You have Austin Dillon starting, was it 18th?
Yeah, Dylan starts 18th. He had the best, he had the best average finish at restrictor plate races last year. He was the only driver to finish inside the top 10 in all 4 restrictor plate races, but he starts 18th. There's a lot of other drivers that are just as good or better that start further back than him. There's also guys like Clint Boyer start one spot ahead of him who I think have a better car. Ryan Blaney in 16th, for example, Boyer in 17th, and Dylan starts 18th. So the pros of fading him are he probably won't be in the winning lineup, especially with all the good cars starting around or behind him. The cons of fading him are I think he'll be really low owned. I think he'll be 5 to 10% owned. So what's the probabilities in the winning lineup? I still think it's in that 5 to 10% range. So maybe it's just a guy you want to either go none on or heavier on and just do a risk reward type thing because there's no point in being GTO with him. I'm going 0% on Dylan.
Interesting there. Is there any driver, I like this question, is there any driver in the back that you feel cannot keep up with the lead pack and would struggle to stay on the lead lap?
I think Jeffrey Earnhardt is definitely the slowest. Whether he can stay in the lead lap, that remains to be seen. It's amazing how the Earnhardt blood there is probably the best and the worst there. But then, I think Joey Gase was a little slower in qualifying, but I think that's just kind of more of a qualifying thing, riding on his own. I think in the draft he'll be fine. As I've talked about, he's been able to keep up. So really the only guy I'm worried about is Jeffrey Earnhardt, and I still think he can keep the lead draft. It's not like Timmy Hill's in the race. He didn't even he was on the DraftKings lineup when we talked about him on the podcast, but he didn't actually end up even practicing or qualifying or anything. So he just didn't show up. So that would be normally the only guy I'd worry about.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. The Earnhardt blood is not strong in that one.
The force is weak in this one.
Yeah, I feel like it's like a Game of Thrones line. Like the line is stronger. Okay, so let's see here. Looking for more. If you had to pick one driver starting in the top, no, not that question. We've already answered that one.
So actually, I wanted to chime in here. So the one we answered about 9K, over 9K, it actually was a question for cash games. He kind of tweeted at me and clarified. So who would I start over 9K in cash games? I would just start Jimmy Johnson. You could make a case for Joey Logano, I guess, but I don't want to start anybody inside the top 15 in cash, really. So only Jimmy Johnson above 9K for me.
Okay. Only Jimmy J above 9K.
In cash, yeah.
In cash. All right. How much does your location on pit row matter, and does it matter more at different tracks?
It definitely matters more at smaller tracks with smaller pit boxes, tighter pit roads. So, obviously things like Martinsville come to mind. Some of these tracks that are just smaller have tighter pit boxes. It's harder to get around the cars that you're when you pit in and pit out, if another guy's pitting in front of you, another guy's pitting behind you, it's hard to squeeze in and out. It costs you a little more time if you're in a bad pit stall relative to a good pit stall where maybe there's a gap in front of you or you got that very first pit stall. So it matters less at Talladega because we have bigger pit boxes, a wider pit road. And I don't think it's going to be too huge of an issue. However, when we do get cautions because of the draft, everybody's typically on the lead lap. We could get 35, 40 guys pitting all at the same time. It can definitely get congested, and that's where you want to pit stop or a pit stall. But I'm not too worried about it because let's say you pit with 10 laps to go and you screw up, you can still come from the back to the front in 10 laps.
I don't think we've talked any about the segments yet or the different sections. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of those and how they will factor into this race?
Yes, I think the segments, as we saw at Daytona, and Daytona is a little more of a wild card because everybody wants to win the Daytona 500, so they're going to press harder sooner. But what we saw at Daytona was everything was pretty tame. There was a minor caution or two. I think one or two car spin outs type thing where they spun to the infield in the first couple segments. But after that second segment ended, it was just chaos. It was like 5 or 6 big wrecks. I don't think we'll see as many at Talladega, but I do think we certainly will see some. And how does the segments come into play? Well, obviously, different strategies can take place under the different segments. You're going to see guys maybe pitting, like we saw at Daytona. We saw the Joe Gibbs Racing guys pit really early into a segment, and 20, 30 laps into a segment at Daytona when it was like a 50-lap segment. I can't remember, 50 or 60, and they ran the whole rest of the way. Kind of not in the lead draft, just the 5 or 6 Joe Gibbs guys racing together by themselves, hoping not to go a lap down. It's going to be even easier to do that at Talladega because the track is even bigger than Daytona. So I certainly think we could see some pit stop strategy, which could shake up dominators, not dominators, but obviously I don't think anybody's going to necessarily dominate the race, but it'll shake up lap leader points and possibly some, if guys are pitting out a sequencer in different points, it'll change the fastest laps as well. I'm not too worried about those, but I really think because of the segments, because of the differing strategies we'll see, it'll be very interesting. We'll have to see which teams use the pit early strategy, which teams don't, but it'll shake things up for sure. So even more randomness to add, I would guess, in terms of those lap leaders.
So maybe more randomness to add, but you mentioned, in terms of lap leaders and dominators and things like that, but you mentioned that at Daytona for the first 2 segments, there really wasn't much randomness in terms of like the chaos of wrecks and things like that.
Right.
Do you think we will see something similar here where there aren't as many wrecks in the first 2 segments, and then all of that chaos is kind of like condensed into the third segment? And if that is the case, what do you think that might mean in terms of like potential strategies for how you would construct your roster, in terms of like thinking that the big one might be later, so you might be more aggressive on certain types of drivers or anything like that?
Yeah, so I actually do think it'll be kind of like Daytona, where most of the wrecks will happen after the second segment ends, if we do get them. It doesn't mean it can't happen, obviously, before. Certainly big ones have happened early in the race. And I do think there is some added incentive, obviously, to finish inside the top 10 for a segment, because you get points for that, especially some of these mediocre teams like, Newman's in because he got the win at Phoenix, but maybe somebody like Jamie McMurray. I know he's 7th in the point standings right now, but all of those points are really going to matter for McMurray. So, maybe somebody like McMurray races hard to get inside that top 10, or maybe somebody who could potentially be on the bubble. Austin Dillon, for example, races hard to get inside that top 10. So we could just see a little bit of intensity near the end of the segments, and certainly we could see a big one triggered then if that is the case, if we got a guy trying to squeeze in from 12th to 10th on the last lap of that segment. So I think it's probably going to be more like Daytona. I think, with most of the wrecks happening after the second segment, but I do think there's even more so relative to Daytona. I think there's added incentive to get inside the top 10. With Daytona, you're not pushing to get inside that top 10, even if you're on a bubble, you think you might be on the bubble for the playoffs later in the season, because you don't want to wreck out in lap 50 and not give yourself a chance to win the Daytona 500. Whereas at Talladega, it's still prestigious, but it's not like the Daytona 500 prestige. So you're more willing to go for those points, I think. So, I think a little bit more potential for a wreck earlier in the race than Daytona, but just as much potential after the second segment than Daytona.
I'm going to question your assumption that the Daytona 500 is more prestigious than Talladega. I mean, has Will Ferrell been in a movie about the Daytona 500?
That's a damn good point. I can't argue that.
Right. Okay, so let's get to questions here. So who do you like best for GPPs? Kurt Busch at 15, Bowyer at 17, Truex at 13.
I'm going to go with Bowyer, then Truex, then Kurt.
Okay. Almirola or McMurray?
I like McMurray better. I think people will be on Almirola because he won the Xfinity race yesterday. He was actually going to be my dark horse sleeper type pick, and then he went ahead and just won the Xfinity race and had different periods of the race where he was leading. And we know he's a good plate racer, so I think I'm going to go with McMurray. I think the two will be pretty equally owned. And in that case, when the two are pretty equally owned and McMurray starts one spot further back and I think has the overall better plate resume, I want McMurray.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you mentioned earlier the possibility of a Harvick-Bowyer stack. Someone is asking about what you think of a Logano and Keselowski stack.
I definitely have a few Logano and Keselowski stacks. I think it's it's possible, like if Keselowski rides that pocket of air and leads 85 laps and wins the race, and Logano comes up and leads a handful of laps and finishes second, I think it's possible the two of them could be in the winning lineup together. I have a handful of those stacks. I wouldn't go crazy on them, obviously, because you're picking two guys starting inside the top 12. And if you do that stack, I pretty much want everybody else to be starting 21st or back. Larson further back. Larson starts 21st, and more preferably 23rd or back with Jamie McMurray. So if I do those stacks, I'm basically picking everybody else starting 23rd or worse as my other four lineup spots.
Right. Okay, so someone's asking a question here. I'm going to add a question to it. So their question is the GPP winner going to have more than $2,000 in salary left? And then my question is, what is the salary range that you are comfortable leaving on the table?
I think the winning lineup will, although certainly it might not this time, because if we do get something like Keselowski, Logano, Jimmy Johnson in the winning lineup, it's possible we have one that's less than 2,000, but I still think it will. I'd put the over-under probably at like 3,300.
Wow.
That's my over-under. And what's the range? I'm fine leaving anywhere from 0 all the way down to I have a couple lineups I think that leave 12,000 on the table. So
wow.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said, a couple years ago at Talladega, 39,100 was the winning, or was the optimal lineup, but nobody had it. But it was the optimal, and I think 38,000 is certainly a viable play if you go something like a Cole Witt, Joey Gase, Brendan Gaughan type lineup where you have three guys in the 30s, and then Danica's starting 31st, but she's only 6,300, which I think is underpriced for her. You've got Chris Buescher only priced 6,500. You've got Elliott Sadler only priced 6,700. Ty Dillon only priced 66. All these guys are starting 28th or worse. You got Reagan at 6,000 starting 29th. All of these guys can be in the winning lineup. Guys and girls can be in the winning lineup, and I certainly think it's possible you could have 3 or 4 of these salary range people, 6,700. Even Allmendinger starting 27th. He's only 6,800. It's crazy. Like, you could have a lineup with 4 of these drivers starting 27th or worse, and then throw in a Jimmy Johnson and a Jamie McMurray, and that's basically like, or maybe not a Jimmy Johnson. Maybe say you throw in a Jamie McMurray and a Almirola or Kyle Larson or something, and that's 10,000 on the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so you've mentioned stacks a couple of times with the Harvick and Boyer and Keselowski and Logano. What are your thoughts on, so I guess 2 questions. What are your thoughts on stacking in NASCAR in general, and then stacking in NASCAR specifically for restrictor plate racing?
Right. So stacking in general, I think, is a strategy you can use when we see either a team or a manufacturer looks like they have some kind of edge. Usually it comes through practice. At Daytona or at Talladega, restrictor plate races, stacking is important because teammates like to try to work together, or manufacturers. So I think we're going to see the Penske's work together. But I also think we're going to see the Penske's work together with the Stewart-Haas cars, because they kind of have a pseudo-alliance now all under the Ford umbrella. I think you're going to see, obviously, if we get down to the end of the race and a bunch of people were wrecked out, but not David Reagan and Landon Castle, I think you're going to try to see them hook up. I think you could see just all sorts of teammates try to push each other to win. Especially in the smaller teams, I think it's important, because they know that's the only way they're going to have somebody work with them, is if it's going to be their teammates. So I kind of like stacking smaller teams even more than big teams. Not that big teams aren't good to stack here at restrictor plate tracks, but I do kind of like some of the smaller team stacks. Maybe it's the like I said, the front row motorsports guys, Castle and Reagan. I don't love that one as much as I would have if Castle didn't qualify 25th and Reagan 29th. But if they were like 32nd and 28th or something, I'd like it a lot more. That said, I still have a tiny bit of those stacks, for example.
Mm-hmm. And congratulations. I think it only took 38 minutes for you to mention Landon Castle.
Yeah, that's well, his car number's 38, so that's perfect.
Yeah, it's big restraint on your part.
Exactly.
Okay, so continuing with this theme of stacking, who are your favorite teammate combos today? Larson, McMurray, Dinger, Buescher, Reagan, Castle. Can you rank those 3 pairings?
Yeah, so Dinger, Buescher is another good one when we talk about smaller teams. They're not as small as Front Row Motorsports, but definitely another good one to stack, especially with as good as Dinger's been lately at plate tracks. So I would definitely rank McMurray Larson as my top stack there. Although I think it's less likely they work together than the other two stacks you mentioned. So you mentioned the Dinger Busher one, and what was the final one?
Reagan Castle.
I like the Dinger Busher stack better simply because they're both starting further back. Like if you compare Castle in 25th, the Dinger in 27th, and then Reagan in 29th, the Busher in 34th or 5th, whatever it is, 35th. I like the Dinger Busher stack better. So sorry, 34th for Busher, but I like that stack better simply because they start further back. I think it's probably more likely that they end up in the winning lineup, but I think the Reagan and Castle stack is more talented at restrictor plate races in terms of the duo, because I don't think Chris Buescher has really shown enough at plate tracks lately. And Allmendinger has been hit or miss at plate tracks. He's, like I said, he's been a lot better lately. He's finished in the top 5 at Daytona, for example, but there have been times where he's just stunk up the joint at plate tracks as well. So I actually think the more talented stack is Reagan Castle, but I'd rank him McMurray Larson, although I think they're less likely to work together than Allmendinger Buescher because they start so far back, and then Castle Reagan.
What's the logic behind thinking that Larson and McMurray may not be likely to work together?
I think they're both in it for the win, right? They want to win, and they have no problem abandoning each other, I guess, to get the win. Right. Although I don't think they're going to intentionally abandon each other until it's time to go. There's definitely a possibility they could work together. I just think relative to the way that Castle or Reagan can win, they pretty much have to have somebody they can trust working with them, because they're not going to do it on their own, most likely. And same for Allmendinger and Buescher. Maybe a little less likely there because Allmendinger, I think, could push into the top 5, whereas Buescher might get separated. But I just think, with the two Ganassi guys, Larson and McMurray, I think they have no problem ditching each other if it means the win, and I think they both will understand.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and this is conjecture on my part, but it seems like also like the owners would be a little more understanding. Like I think for Dinger and Buescher and Reagan and Castle, it's more important for them to be good teammates because they are in lower tier teams. So I think like it's more important to the owners that they help each other.
I would 100% agree with the front row guys. Maybe with JTG Doherty, I'm little less there. Yes, they are a smaller team. They're not a small team. Right. They're certainly a mid-pack team, like right. On the Almirola or the Bain, Stenhouse level, Danica level. They're certainly a mid-pack team. But another thing that concerns me, of course, in terms of that stack is Chris Buescher is only on loan to JTG Doherty right now. So I don't know what the teammate incentive is to work together beyond this year to develop that chemistry.
Mm-hmm. Will drivers starting 25th to 29th be too under-owned given everyone seeming to target the drivers starting 30th or later?
I think Matt DiBenedetto will be way under-owned. I think he's starting 26th there. Most people will not use him because if they're going to play somebody cheap, they're going to play guys starting in the 30s. So I don't mind a strategy where you play DiBenedetto 10, 15%, and he's only 5% owned, given he's starting 26th. I still think it's not that likely he ends up in the winning lineup. I think it's probably around 8% maybe would be my guess if I had to put a number on it, plus or minus a little bit. So I think that 5% ownership is a fair number, but if you want some leverage, I don't mind that. I do think Castle will probably be under-owned as well because he starts 25th rather than 29th relative to like David Reagan, his teammate. I don't think Reagan will be too under-owned. He's got 2 plate wins. And then 27th and 28th are Allmendinger and Ty Dillon. I think both of them will be pretty highly owned, especially Ty Dillon, I think will be higher owned than Allmendinger. But that's a guess. That's a guess, actually. I don't know.
I like this next question. Hey, guys, I have 50 lineups made, and about 35 of them have $10,000 left on the table. Do you think this is okay? If not, what percentage might be ideal?
I think it's probably too many. I do want to take, at Talladega, I want to take more shots at guys starting a little further forward because it happens more than it does at the Daytona 500. But I certainly don't mind 10% of your lineups leaving that much on the table.
That's fantastic.
It sounds crazy, but it might work too. I mean, you never know. If we have a race where just carnage and those back markers just aren't, competitive, or not competitive, but they're hanging out in kind of a separate second pack, maybe. It's certainly possible. I mean, like I said, we saw a lineup one year where JJ Yaley, Josh Wise, and Cole Witt were in the winning lineup.
Yeah, this feels like a very Bales power move. Like it seems like this would be like a high leverage. Like if you want to try to win huge and you're fine losing.
Well, and I don't think it's actually a losing play because they all start in the 30s, right? It's not like you're gonna get crushed if playing that strategy. You might lose a little bit, but I think because we will see Rex, we will see a couple of those guys starting in the 30s get enough place differential. I don't think you're going to lose big. I think you might lose medium or small, but I think you have the potential to win big if that strategy does pay off. So it depends on your risk tolerance. I think it's a risky move. I think the GTO move is maybe like 10% of those lineups instead of, 10 of those 50 lineups instead of 35 of those 50, but it depends on your risk tolerance. I think it's a high risk play, but it's a high risk play in terms of like most likely you're not going to win, but you probably won't lose a ton.
Yeah, it's amazing. Is the real GPP play to go with the top 20 drivers because most people will be going with the back 20?
I think the real GPP play is to I don't know. That's a tough one because I definitely have some exposure to the guys in the top 20. My exposure is pretty spread out. I basically don't have anybody inside the top 17 unless they're a big name. So Boyer starts 17th and on back. I have exposure to most of those guys. Like I said, I don't have Dylan. I only have a tiny bit of Castle and Di Benedetto. I have zero McDowell, I think. So everybody else I have exposure to, except Jeffrey Earnhardt and Greg Alding as well.
Are you using the top 20 drivers more to differentiate your lineups as opposed to kind of going fuller in on them?
Yeah. So I don't have a huge exposure to the guys in the top 20. I think my highest exposure is Joey Logano, who's maybe in 22% of my lineups or something like that is I think what I calculated.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you talked earlier about Hamlin as a potential kind of dark horse dominator. Someone's asking, would you bother even to have Hamlin or Kyle Busch around 5% ownership in GPPs, or would you just fade completely?
I don't mind exposure to either. I have exposure to both. I have higher exposure to Hamlin than Kyle Busch. I think just given plate track history and the fact that I think Denny Hamlin will be under-owned relative to the proportion of the time he can get up front and win the race. And I think if he gets up front, leads 20 to 40 laps minimum, and then wins the race, he could be in the winning lineup.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned Ty Dillon and how you like him, but maybe pivoting to Allmendinger and Reagan. Someone's asking what you think about Ty Dillon and cash.
I don't hate Ty Dillon in cash. I think if you're going to play Ty Dillon in cash, I don't know what your rest of your roster looks like, but I would certainly consider, Jimmy and Danica and Chris Buescher and Elliott Sadler all starting behind him as better plays. And then even somebody like Cole Witt, for example, who's shown to be a guy who can consistently finish inside the top 25 at plate tracks, who has no downside, essentially starting in 38th. So I don't mind Ty Dillon in cash. I think if I were to make 5 cash lineups, which I probably will do this week, he might be in one of them. But so that kind of tells you, my enthusiasm for him in cash is about, if I were to play 5, I would have him maybe in 20%.
Mm-hmm. Someone was asking about the ownership projection for Dale Jr. and what you think about that, because everyone always seems to love Dale Jr. at the restrictor plate races.
Certainly my model is based off of only 2 races. It's based off the Daytona 500 and then last year's last Talladega race. And what I found is this year's Daytona 500 was much more sharp compared to last year's races. People have gotten a lot better. There's a lot more content in the industry for NASCAR DFS, and there was a ton of content for the Daytona 500 between all the different sites. There's even more sites out there now as well. So we saw at the Daytona 500, Dale Jr. started up there in that front row and was only, was it 12 to 15% owned? I think he could be even less owned this time. I think 5% is probably too low. People do like using Dale Jr. I think 10 to 12% is probably where we'll see Dale Jr. Although, I don't know. I mean, it just depends on especially if the sharper players are sticking around relative to Daytona, where a lot of people are taking shots at a huge tournament. We could see his ownership percentage be even less than 12 to 10%, but I think it'll be around 12 to 10%. So I think my model, which is strictly a model based off of data and numbers, it doesn't use any of my opinions, which is what's nice about it, is probably a little low on him.
Let's see here. We've got about 50 minutes. Do you have any more? Think you have anything more to say, or you kind of? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing here this week for me will be making sure you get the right amount of exposure to guys starting inside the top 25 or 4 or whatever it is, inside the top 23, McMurray and forward, because more so than the Daytona 500, we see winning lineups with guys in the 20s, a few guys even like 15th or back, and then a handful of drivers starting before 15th. So like we talked about, Hamlin, Logano, the guys that we tend to see in the winning lineup that start further forward than 15th are drivers that win the race and lead a good chunk of laps. So those are the only guys I'll be using inside the top 15, are guys I think will win the race and lead a chunk of laps. That means no Stenhouse, no Trevor Bayne. It's not that they can't win, but I don't think they'll lead enough laps, even if they do win, to justify being in the winning lineup because they start so far forward.
All right. Let's see here. I think that's going to do it here. So, yeah, that was the good Nick. Stuff. Anything else?
We're good. I only got down to here, man. That's disappointing.
No, you were talking too much.
Yeah. So it was a good show. Right. Really great questions this week, and I'm glad you all asked them because it's certainly a little different from the Daytona 500. Still important for place differential, but definitely a little different than Daytona.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's going to do it for this NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. For Nick Giffen on Twitter @RotoDoc, I'm Matt Friedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.